Welcome to the American Society of Agronomy's webinar series on cover crops. My name is Luther Smith, the Director of Certification and Online Education for ASA, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. I'd like to start off by thanking our sponsors. The generous support of our sponsors have made it possible to bring you this webinar at no charge to the participants. And they are SARE, Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education, Iowa SARE, Minnesota SARE, National Association of Conservation Districts, DuPont Pioneer, Cover Crop Solutions LLC, National Wildlife Federation, Grassland Oregon, the Cross Seed, the Cisco Companies, American Farmland Trust, Department of Soil Science, University of Wisconsin, Lincoln Board Aerial Spraying and Seeding, and Practical Farmers of Iowa. I'd also like to give a special thank you to Sarah Carlson, Practical Farmers of Iowa, and Ryan Stockwell, National Wildlife Federation. Sarah and Ryan's help put this together, identifying speakers and organizing the webinar series for us. And you're probably also aware that this is the first of a four-part webinar series. So if you registered for today and are attending, you have the option to also attend 3 other components if you haven't done that yet. And next Thursday, March 13th, we'll be doing combining livestock, manure, and cover crops. Followed on the 20th, cover crop seed selection and planting. And then on March 27th, cover crop management and termination. If you'd like to learn more about these or to register for them, just go to the website, www.agronomy.org. And you do need to register for them individually, so you receive the connection details. For additional resources, we'd like to recommend checking out the SARE website, Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education. The SARE programs provide farmers, researchers, professionals, and graduate student opportunities to conduct research that advances sustainable agricultural practices. To learn more about cover crops following this webinar, check out the cover crops topic room on the SARE webpage on your screen. And then also we were asked about insurance, cover crops as it relates to crop insurance. We were not going to cover this topic during today's webinar because that was covered on a January 23rd webinar. So if you'd like to learn more about the specifics with crop insurance and cover crops, take a look at the link that we're showing on screen now, and that'll give you that webinar and that additional information. So during today's webinar, if you'd like to ask a question, just type it in the question box that's located in the dashboard, and that's the menu list that will pop up when you connected to the webinar. Look for the question box towards the bottom, and then you can type your question in there, and we will field those questions at the appropriate time. So moving on to today's topic and the speakers. Today's topic is cover crops, soil health principles, and maximizing yield. Kristine Nichols is a research soil microbiologist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service, Northern Great Plains Research Laboratory in Mandan, North Dakota. Her research and professional achievements have focused on the impacts of cropping and grazing systems on soil microbiology, nutrient cycling, and soil aggregation to improve soil health and water quality. And Chris will be followed by Ray McCormick. McCormick Farms has been working with cover crops over 20 years on several thousand acres of both owned and rented land in southern Indiana. He will share his practical experiences incorporating cover crops in the operation and the benefits that he's gained. So we're going to have Chris start off today's webinar, and I'll switch over to her screen because it'll just take a moment to do that. So Chris, I'll make you the presenter.
Hi. Sorry, I got lost for a second.
No problem. You came on right in time.
Okay. So I guess I apologize. I got disconnected for a little bit and didn't realize it. But kind of to just get started, I guess, what I want to talk about, hopefully you can see my screen. Everything okay?
Your Kristine, looks good.
Okay. So what I want to talk to you today about is the role of soil biology in our systems, and especially in systems that incorporate cover crops. And in the title it says in carbon-limited systems. And the thing with our systems are, most of our systems are carbon-limited. A lot of times when we talk about limitations in our systems, we're focused on things that have to do with climate or have to do with nutrients, but especially when it comes from the perspective of soil organisms and soil health, a lot of this has to do with carbon limitations. And cover crops can be a solution to help to resolve some of those limitations. So I want you to think about the soil, and the soil is the heart of that system. It connects the above ground and the below ground. It's the ultimate recycler. It's the ultimate decomposer. It's the ultimate receptacle for providing for clean air and clean water. It drives all of the physical and chemical and biological processes that are happening both above ground and below ground. And it also provides for the most efficient mechanisms. And that's really what I'm going to focus on, is this fact that when we can solve some of these carbon limitation issues when it comes to the organisms in the soil, we're going to utilize them to work with water and nutrients in our system in the most efficient manner. And so we're going to be able to reap incredible amounts of value from that soil. You can get value from the soil organic matter that contains the nutrients that the plant needs. Soil organic matter can also help to build soil structure and allow for better water infiltration, better water holding capacity, and better aeration, and reducing compaction for better root growth, as well as for happy microorganisms. It's estimated that the value of these organisms themselves can be at least $1.5 trillion per year on a global basis. So this is something that, from an economic standpoint, we really can't afford not to be tapping into. We need to be looking at these organisms and figuring out ways that we can utilize these efficient mechanisms that they've designed. So when I think about this, a lot of times, again, we think about problems that we have and limitations that we have. But in reality, again, if you look at carbon as the major flow in these systems, then really the root of the problem is the root of the solution. It's having roots in that soil environment, because those roots are going to provide not just carbon in their own bodies and their own structures, but they're also going to give off exudates that are going to feed the soil biology. So you're going to get this rhizosphere environment where there's a tremendous amount of microbial activity. And what we want to see, again, is we want to see more of that carbon going below ground. And in that carbon, the way that carbon gets into all of the systems on planet Earth, almost all of the organisms are carbon-based. All life is carbon-based, with very few exceptions. So what we need to have is we need to have carbon going from the atmosphere as CO2 through photosynthesis and into the plants. And then that provides for all of the carbon that provide the cellular building blocks for all of the organisms. It provides for all of their energy needs. It provides for the enzymes and the proteins, and everything that is life is carbon-based. And that's where I mean that our systems are carbon limited, because we don't have this life without addressing that carbon limitation. And we've got billions of organisms that are in the soil. It's said that in about a handful of healthy soil, there are more organisms than the number of people who ever lived on planet Earth. And so this is a huge amount of hungry organisms that are trying to get food. And again, the food is going to come to them either directly or indirectly from the plants, from that photosynthetic action. So you want to make sure, again, that you're feeding this huge diversity of organisms. And these organisms all play different roles in nutrient cycling, in water management, in the health of the plants and the health of that soil environment. And that's going to be able to assist us in being able to address some of these issues. So these organisms, like I said, they're all hungry. And for the most part, they're starving and they're homeless. When we think of all organisms, I think that we need to think of things very simply and address some of the basic needs of all the organisms in the soil and all of the organisms both above ground and below ground. And when we're addressing basic needs, the first thing that we need to satisfy is food. We want to make sure that all of these organisms have the food in order for them to be able to live and grow and reproduce and function in that soil environment, just like we do. We need to have food. And then some of the second issues that we can address in our management systems are things that are going to help them deal with being homeless. The organisms are going to try and create an environment. They actually can engineer soil. They engineer soil structure, and they do that to create an environment in which they can live and grow and flourish, and in which they can act in the most efficient manner. And what I mean by this is when you want to do things most efficiently, you try and get as much as you can for the least cost. And that's what these organisms are trying to do. And so they'll engineer a habitat in which they can be protected from the environment as well as protected from predators, but they can also be in an environment where the resources that they need in order to be able to get their food from the plant can be obtained very easily. And so we want to make sure that we've basically designed an environment so that these organisms can grow and flourish and not starve and not be homeless. I'm sure many of you have probably seen this diagram or similar diagrams of the soil food web. And what I want to show from here is not necessarily to look at all of the organisms and all of the interactions in that food web. It's a very complex environment in which organisms are not interacting on their own. When I first started graduate school, we talked about the fact that we knew and understood and maybe could culture about 10% of the organisms that were in the soil. And by about the time that I was done with my PhD, we were thinking we were more looking at maybe 0.1% or even less. So as we've gotten advances in technology and are realizing more and more of what's out there, and are getting an understanding of the fact that a lot of these organisms function in very multi-layered, symbiotic, interactive relationships. And so we need to be able to figure out ways to recognize that, and we may not be able to always look at particular organisms and be able to see all of these multi-layers, but we may be able to see some of the things that function, some of the functions that come out of those activities. But what I really want to focus in on this diagram is that first trophic level. Again, sort of re-emphasizing this point of the carbon limitation in our systems. Because if you don't have that first trophic level, the rest of it doesn't really matter. If you can't get carbon into the system, it doesn't matter how many bugs that you have, they aren't going to be able to survive and thrive. And that's, again, one of the things that cover crops, and I'm sure Ray's going to be addressing this when he's talking about his cropping systems. One of the things that it does is it extends that growing season and allows for more carbon to be able to get into that soil food web and to feed those organisms. Again, everything directly or indirectly functions by the carbon limitations. I've got to notice that may have connection difficulties. Can everybody still hear me?
Chris, you still there?
Yep. Am I still connected?
You're still going.
Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. So I guess where did I leave off? We're talking about the soil food web. Am I still there?
You're still here, Chris. You can keep going.
Hello?
Chris, okay. You're coming through loud and clear. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So one of the organisms that plays a very important role in the efficiencies of these processes are the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And literally what the name means is arbor-like trees, so they're tree-like. Myco is the Greek word for fungus, rhiz is the Greek word for root, so they're tree-like fungus root fungi. And the reason that I point that out is because that tree-like structure is what's really important to the efficiency in their processes. So what these fungi do is they actually can grow inside the roots, and they grow inside and penetrate the root cell wall and grow up to the cell plasma membrane and form these highly branched tree-like structures. And nature repeats what works well. And these fungi evolved with the first land plants. So before we had trees and before we had things that we started associating with the word arbor, we had these fungi. And if it didn't work and it wasn't a very efficient mechanism, nature wouldn't have repeated that in the formation of plants and in the formation of trees that form the branches, so that the tree or the plant always has some branches or some leaves that are going to be in contact with sun as the sun passes overhead. There's always going to be some leaves in shade, but there's always going to be some leaves in sun. The same thing happens below ground with these fungi, where what they do is form these highly branched structures inside the root cells so that they can have greater contact. It's a greater surface area to volume ratio. So they have greater contact with that cell membrane. And then they'll go out of the root and out into the soil, and they're forming these highly branched structures out there, so they have greater contact with the soil environment. So there's always going to be branches that are going to be able to be in contact with the nutrients or the water that's out in that soil, so that the fungi can take that up and bring that back to the plant. And what they do is they exchange those nutrients and water with the plant for carbon that the plant gets by photosynthesis. So again, it's a very efficient mechanism of utilizing that carbon and addressing those carbon limitations. And even though this may not be things that go, very far out into the soil, they are things that can play a much greater role in being able to improve plant health and plant nutrition status, because they're able to get that greater contact. And in fact, some of the largest organisms in the world are different types of fungi that have these great extensive hyphal networks. So the more that we leave the soil undisturbed, the better these networks can remain in that soil environment, and the better that they're able to branch out into that soil environment in order to be able to pick up those nutrients and be more efficient at this. These fungi are associated with almost all of the crop plants. There are some exceptions in the brassica family, and there is some potential that they may not necessarily colonize those roots of the brassicas, but especially if those plants are used in a crop rotation or are used in a cover crop mixture, they may be able to tap into some of the things that those plants do, as far as those plants can be very good at obtaining nitrogen from deep in the soil and bringing it up into the surface. They're also associated with other organisms in the soil, and in that process, then the fungi might be able to tap into that if they're growing side by side in the same year or in subsequent years. So it doesn't mean that when you have non-mycorrhizal crops, it is completely destroying your system. It's sort of possibly taking some time off, but maybe being able to provide some things that can be responded to better in the future. And again, this is something where we want to have that carbon transfer to these organisms. In addition to being able to provide carbon for themselves, these organisms can interact with other organisms out in the soil. So the mycorrhizal fungi can act a little bit like a pipeline connecting the plant roots with the soil environment, but out there in that soil environment, these fungi can interact with bacteria and other fungi in order to be able to get nutrients released from organic matter. So the organisms that can act as decomposers, or the organisms that have the enzymes to convert nutrients from an unavailable form into a plant available form, can be fed by these fungi with the carbon that these fungi got from the plant, and then utilize that. The fungi will exchange that carbon for those nutrients that those organisms release, and then can transfer those back. Again, these organisms can be affected by the rotation that you have. So you want to make sure that you've got plants in your rotation that are going to be colonized by mycorrhizal fungi. And again, if you're utilizing cover crops and if you're utilizing cover crop mixtures, to have a mixture of both non-mycorrhizal and mycorrhizal plants. If you have a fallow period, that's going to basically be a period in which these fungi have no mechanism for being able to get carbon. So it's a time in which they're not being fed, and then they're going to have to survive whatever types of conditions they're confronted with throughout that fallow period, whether temperatures are very high or temperatures are very low, rainfall, predators, dry periods. All of these things can have negative impacts on those hyphal networks. And then again, they're very important at creating this mycorrhizosphere, or this habitat around the fungal hyphae where they can feed all of these different organisms. And that can be very important in improving nitrogen or nutrient use efficiency. When we look at a lot of our crop production systems, we're adding a lot of synthetic nutrients to the system, but not all of those nutrients are going to be in a plant-available form. And even if they are in a plant-available form, they're not going to necessarily stay that way, or they're going to be lost from the system by leaching out through the bottom of the system, or running off of the surface, or going back up into the atmosphere as a gas. So the nutrients that we're adding aren't always making their way into that plant. And this graph shows that although we've had increases in yields, which you'll see at the top is an increase in global cereal yield over time, which has been very significant, but at the same time our nutrient use efficiency, or our nitrogen use efficiency, has rapidly declined. And this nitrogen use efficiency in the bottom graph is not based on it takes yield into account in the fact that this is on a per amount of grain basis. It's not done so that as we've increased yields, obviously we've had to put more nitrogen into the system to be able to get those yields. But this takes into account that. So what this is looking at directly is at the efficiency of the system. And so that nitrogen is not being used very efficiently anymore. And why is that happening in our systems? I mean, you would think that a system wouldn't quit being efficient. A plant wouldn't quit being efficient in its ability to take up nitrogen from the soil. What it is it's a management issue more so than a plant issue. The plants can only take up so much, and then they need to be able to have those nutrients throughout the growing season, as opposed to having them at very short windows of time, which is oftentimes what happens in our crop production systems, is we add the nutrients that the plant needs for the whole growing season to obtain those yield goals, but we do that in very short windows of time. And the plants don't have storage capacity. They don't have the ability to take up all those nutrients and wait until it is that they're producing grain to be able to utilize them. So the more nutrients that we've added to some of our systems, the less of them that have always made it into the grain or the yields that we're producing. On top of that, as we get the plants more reliant upon the nutrients that we add to our systems, they become less reliant upon the organisms that are in the soil. And so they don't feed those organisms. And when they don't feed those organisms, then those organisms' population starts to decline. And so we're losing the health and the biology in our soil systems. Now, as I said, the mycorrhizal fungi can work with a number of different organisms. They work with phosphate solubilizing bacteria. They work with decomposing bacteria. They'll work with nitrogen fixing bacteria. They'll work with fungi that are functioning in decomposition processes in order to be able to supply the nutrients the plant needs, especially in the case of phosphorus and nitrogen. They're very good at being able to supply those things. In addition to that, the hyphae can fuse together from one network to another network. So you'll have a network that may branch out from one plant roots and a network that's branching out from a plant growing next to it. And these fungi can fuse those networks together. In addition, the fungal hyphae from one plant root may be able to grow and actually grow into the roots of a nearby plant. And so they're creating these plant-to-plant connections that can't be made by the roots. The roots have no way to fuse themselves together, and the roots from one plant won't grow into the roots or into another plant. But the fungi can do this, and so they'll be connecting these various plants together in a system. And this is kind of what you can see here. You'll have fungal hyphae, and you'll have roots that can be growing next to each other from a grass plant and from a legume plant. That legume will be associated with the bacteria that form the nodules, and in those nodules, those bacteria will fix nitrogen. And the hyphae will, that nitrogen will go into the roots, will be picked up by the fungal hyphae, and can be carried to a neighboring plant, can be carried to a grass plant that isn't associated with the bacteria that can fix nitrogen. This can also help to address some of the needs that the bacteria have that are fixing nitrogen. Nitrogen fixation on an organism level is an energy-intensive process, just like it is for us to do above ground. And the energy that's required in this process, it comes in the form of, within the mitochondria, you have ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, that's getting cycled into ADP. And as that phosphate is pulled off, it provides electrons for the electron transport chain, which basically fires those mitochondria batteries. And that provides the energy for nitrogen fixation. The fungal hyphae, when the fungi are associated with the grasses will stimulate these fungi to pick up a lot of excess phosphate. And they'll pick up some of this excess phosphate, and they can give some of that phosphate through that hyphal pipeline to the legume that will give that to the bacteria. The bacteria use that to fix nitrogen, and then that nitrogen can be transported to the grass as well as in the legume. And all of this is happening in an interconnected pipeline that is a very efficient flow mechanism, because there isn't a lot of excess water that's needed to do this. It's all happening through nutrients that are flowing through cytoplasmic materials, rather than having to go outside of the hyphae or outside of the roots and then be picked up by hyphae or roots of another plant. So it's all happening internally, which allows it to be very efficient, utilize very little water, and retain those nutrients that are being transferred. Again, this can help with water use efficiency. So as you can see, plants can utilize different amounts of water, and they'll do that at different times, and they'll do that also when they come under nutrient stress. So if a plant is under nutrient stress, it may need more water in order to get those nutrients to that plant. But as we improve these systems and create these multi-layered hyphal networks with interactions with bacteria and other organisms, again, we're going to lose a lot less water, and we're going to lose a lot less nutrients, and that's going to improve the efficiency of the system. In addition to that, these organisms help to create, especially the fungal hyphae, will help to create aggregates or pellets in the soil. And those aggregates can help to structure soil where you'll have greater porosity. And as you can see, when you improve porosity, it's going to drastically increase the infiltration rate, not just of the first inch of water, but also the second inch of water. So your soils can take in more water and hold on to that water for a longer period of time. And we were able to see this out in the field in various numbers of experiments. This is actually from a soil conservation district demonstration farm here in North Dakota. And these were pictures that were taken on the same day, fields that were right next to each other. And where you had a mixture of different crops, they were able to grow and thrive and survive even on very little soil moisture, whereas if you had one species, that wasn't able to happen. And again, I think a lot of this has to do with this fact that you have these efficient mechanisms that can connect these plants together through these mycorrhizal fungi and through the activity with other organisms. So again, as you enhance the amount of carbon that's going below ground, as you put more crops into the system and you're improving the productivity of the system, you're actually improving those efficiencies where you're creating an environment where you're banking more carbon and giving more to these organisms for them to thrive and survive. And that carbon is then going to be provided. You're going to have primary carbon and secondary carbon. And what I mean by that is, again, this goes back to the needs of the organisms. The first thing that the organisms are going to allocate carbon to is to growing, reproduction, and extending out their bodies when it comes to the fungal hyphae, growing those hyphal networks out further into the soil environment, making more branches, all of those types of things. But the secondary thing that they're going to start to address is things like habitat. And this again comes where we're looking at soil aggregates or soil structure, building these pellets in that soil environment. And this can happen in a relatively short period of time. The two pictures at the bottom, the one where you see the hands in there, that one is from a pot culture experiment. You can see all those aggregates that were formed there. We did that in a 1-to-1 sand-soil mixture, and those aggregates grew in about a 3-month period of time. Whereas the other picture on the bottom, this was from a farmer's field, and this was in a cover crop mixture that was planted after a forage pea crop, and this was done in North Dakota. The forage pea crop was harvested in early July. A couple days later, this cover crop mixture was planted. I went out there at the end of August and took these samples and were able to get the roots with all of those aggregates growing on there. So in a relatively short period of time, you can get this carbon allocated to this aggregate formation if there's enough carbon already in the system to address the primary needs. So cover crops, again, can help to address some of these secondary carbon needs that can allow for this enhancement of soil health and soil structure via aggregates. And this is just a picture of something that I work a lot with, a substance called glomalin, which is a biomolecule produced by the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. There's other biomolecules produced by all different types of organisms in the soil, and they're all going to contribute to helping to engineer that soil environment, to create these soil aggregates. And one of the things that we're finding is that how we manage our soil has a very big impact on the stability of those aggregates. So in some systems, we may be able to get aggregates formed. You can form aggregates mechanically as well as biologically, but are those aggregates stable? When it rains, are they going to stay together, or are they going to fall apart into primary particles? And so this is what we're seeing as we look at conventional systems. We'll see aggregate stability levels that'll be, roughly between 10 and 25%. In no-till systems, we can get that up to maybe about 50%. In some cases, maybe a little bit higher than that. But when we look at range systems or undisturbed systems, our aggregate stability levels are much higher, 80 to 100%. And so why is that? What is that difference between our ag systems and some of our range systems? And again, I think that a lot of this has to do with the amount of carbon that can get into the system, so the amount of time that you have a plant growing. And in those range systems, there's almost always some type of living plant that's growing. Whereas in our agricultural systems, we have very short windows in which we have a plant growing. And the other thing with that is when that plant is going through vegetative growth as opposed to reproductive growth. Because when the plant is going through vegetative growth, then that carbon is being allocated below ground. But when it's in reproductive growth, that carbon is going to be allocated above ground. And so as we look at our cropping systems, that's a very short window. Here in North Dakota, where we grow a lot of short season crops, it's an extremely short window, often about a month's period of time. And we're expecting those billions of organisms to have enough carbon to survive and thrive for 11 months on 1 month of input of carbon. And those are the things that I think we need to start addressing and start looking at as we're trying to improve our systems. So as kind of has been said by a number of other people, the Howard Buffett Foundation recently had a cover crop forum in which we were looking at, and he talks about this idea of the brown revolution. The new green revolution isn't going to be as much focused on what the plants can do as what the soil can do, because we need to start addressing some of these efficiencies and being able to utilize our nutrients and our water much more efficiently in order to be able to maintain our yields. So what in this new brown revolution we need to do is to cultivate the organisms in the soil. And that means addressing their food needs and addressing some of their habitat needs, and making sure that they have enough carbon to be able to not be limited in the system. Instead of focusing so much on some things that are more of symptoms of a problem, the problem really being that our systems are carbon limited. And so if we can address that carbon limitation, we're going to be able to improve those systems. So I just kind of wanted to end there and hopefully be able to get you to kind of be thinking about some of this stuff. And sometimes when I look at some of this stuff, and as we were talking before we started, some of these things that we're utilizing are tools that we've had for a number of years. And so when we look at this, to be a successful farmer, one must first know the nature of soil. This was a quote from 400 BC. We obviously know what it is that we need to do. Now we just need to implement those tools to be able to get us to that point where we're improving the efficiencies in our systems. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Kristine. And now we'll shift over to Ray. Ray, you can start when you're ready.
Okay. Yeah. Good afternoon. Ray McCormick from southwestern Indiana. As you can see there, I'm in far southern Indiana on the Indiana-Illinois line. I farm about 2,400 acres of tillable acres and have a lot of woodlands and wetlands habitat. I have a quite diverse farm. We grow peaches on our windblown lust. I do a lot of wetland restorations. Indiana formerly had a lot of wetlands. I manage for migratory birds and waterfowl. Part of my business is flooding cornfields and waterfowl hunting in the fall. So when we're talking about diversity and creating habitat and healthy soils, a lot of what I like to look at is also the health of the wildlife on the farm. I started using no-till cover crops in June of 1986, and at that time I took the advice of a crop consultant who said, you got to do it the way I tell you. So we sowed air-seeded wheat in the fall and rented a drill, and that was my first attempt at growing no-till soybeans into cover crops, and that was very successful and had a lot of success. Soon after that, we started upgrading our equipment and investing in our own equipment, and I really went away from cover crops on a lot of the ground because I only looked at cover crops as a way to control erosion, and in some of our flatter, better soils, I thought I didn't need a cover crop. So I've been no-tilling ever since 1986, but just in the last decade or so, I really went back to cover crops. And whenever we're talking about cover crops, we always have to talk about the equipment that is needed to get a good stand, of corn in our cover crops. So we always at our soil health meetings and our cover crop meetings talk a lot about corn planters, setting up corn planters, how to get that seed into the ground, but also how to place nutrients beside the row. And in the planter that I've been using in the past, we both use pop-up and 2x2 placement so that we could get that nitrogen beside the row, because many of our cover crops in this area are cereal rye, are Oregon annual ryegrass, and so we would be in a nitrogen-limited environment where we needed to get some nutrients quickly beside the row to get that corn off to a quick start, to get that good green color. You really can't compete with conventional corn in yields and stands unless you have a planter that's ready to do that and you've got the nutrients available to that plant so it doesn't go needing any nutrients at any time in that carbon-rich environment. And then these are some of those fields we just looked at where we actually flood water over the fields in the wintertime, leave standing corn, and now these corn planters are good enough to be able to plant not only into cover crops but a lot of standing residue. And of course, having a good stand, having vigorous corn growth is the key to growing those kind of yields that make you successful as a farmer. So this is a river bottom field that you can see there. We side dressed it. We got off to a good start, and we've got a great stand. And we're living really on top of the world, having captured a lot of the tools that we have available to us today. However, with the kind of rainfalls that we have, this is what that field looked like just 2 days later after a heavy rainfall in the summer, June of 2008. This highway that had been built to withstand 2 foot above the biggest floods in history. We had 2 floods within a year and a half go over the top of the highway. In the background, you can see my corn crop 2 days before you saw it. Now you see it 2 days later and what's happening. And part of what we do with cover crops and healthy soils is start building our watersheds to be able to hold that water, to be able to hold that nitrogen, to increase the porosity, to help downstream farmers not have to endure the kind of floods that we do now, but also to hold that water in place. This was some pictures taken on conventionally tilled soils in central Indiana after that rainfall event in June. When we're paying $10,000 an acre for land in my area, that's what the latest land went for in auction. When we're talking about saving prime farmland, we have to talk about building resiliency, building those soils to where they can withstand the kind of heavy rainfalls. Not only does it impact me as a downstream landowner, but it impacts the soils that are so valuable and will be so limited in the future to feeding a growing population. What economic incentive is there to growing cover crops and to holding onto your soil? This is a layer of soil that we took out of one of my duck blinds after just one flood. 3/8 of an inch of soil, or about 30 tons per acre of the world's best topsoil, was deposited on one of my fields in just one flood. And here you can see the nutrient value of those soils. The soil pH of 7.3, phosphorus 93 pounds, potash 288 pounds. Just think of the value of the soils that are going into the Gulf and into the hypoxia zone. There isn't any farmer in the Midwest that doesn't want to hold on to his nutrients. And again, improving water infiltration has an impact. This is what I have to stare at all summer long, is the river going from 8 foot to 18.5 foot, well above flood stage. And that's the impact that our watersheds are having downriver. To do this, it takes a reversal of concepts. So we've started the Conservation Cropping Systems Initiative here in Indiana. Many states are looking at that. It's a partnership among our conservation partners. Really in soil health, we're driving with the tools of no-till, cover crops, nutrient management, and pest management. Here's an example of one of my farms where we let the cover crops get pretty big. This is a combination of cereal rye and Austrian winter peas, and as you can see, we're planting into that. It takes a good planter and it takes strong spirit to be able to plant into cover crops that big. So I'm testing out, doing a whole gamut of different practices using cover crops, because this is really an evolving frontier. Most farmers I would encourage to burn down that cover crop. It's a little too treacherous and a little bit too much for people just getting into cover crops to have to plant into that. So most of the time, part of growing cover crops is understanding the termination of cover crops and how we do that effectively. And I see that Mike Plummer, who is a real expert on this, will be speaking one of the upcoming webinars. And of course, what we have the opportunity to do in the southern corn belt where I'm at is to fill in some of those gaps we talked about. Instead of just growing corn over a short period of the year here in the southern corn belt, we really got a chance to get a lot of green on the fields in the fall. And then usually, not this winter, but in most winters, by mid-February to early March, we're green back up and sequestering carbon, building root systems, and really getting a lot of benefit. So if we can grow something on these fields 80 to 90% of the year versus just 1/3 of the year, it gives us a tremendous opportunity to build soils. One of the keys that I do in my farming operation is I plant deep. And with these healthy soils and these root systems, with this kind of soil aggregate, I'm now planting corn at 2.5 to 3 inches deep, and it can come through more consistently when you have all these root systems that are built in with these cover crops. And of course, this is what you're looking for at harvest, is you want that mat still on the ground, you still want good cover, but you see the health of these corn plants. And this is a farm that I just started renting about 3 years ago, and already we're beginning to build that carpet on top of the ground that brings that soil health back. and translate that into the health of these corn plants. And I'm a true believer, if you really want to reach top level yields, that you have to have healthy soils. You may have seen in the latest corn yield contest from the, I think it was Progressive Farmer, that the top new record in corn yield in the United States was established and won by a person using never till, and that's what I believe in, is never tilling that ground. No till is not no tilling it 1 year and then the next. It's no tilling permanently, or never tilling the ground. And this is a transformation of concepts, cycling nutrients more rapidly. Nutrients are less likely to be lost. Improving soil structure, infiltration, water holding capacity. In the drought of 12, that turned out to be a key role of our healthy soils, is holding on to what rainfall we had in these heavy rainfall events, but when the first rain came in midsummer, not having runoff and having great infiltration of the rains that literally saved our crops. Better disease suppression, using less inputs on our farms, making them more profitable, and filtering pollutants and doing all we can to control runoff into the drinking water. Is built in Indiana on partnerships. Many partners we brought together. Farmers can't do this. None of us can do this on its own. It's a collaboration of all of our different partners coming together, our commodity groups and our soil and water conservation districts. We've set up many hub farms all across our different areas of Indiana, and with our universities, we now have 17 hub farms in Indiana demonstrating in our area, in your local region, what works, how it works, what we're having problem with, how to implement those practices, how to mentor and encourage others to do the same, and then really to evaluate just how well these are working. Again, and this is an example of some of the cover crops that I used to use on my farm when I drilled all of my cover crops, and my favorite here was cereal rye, Austrian winter peas, 30 pounds of each. And here's an example of a mixture that I planted with a drill, and this is a mixture of crimson clover, annual ryegrass, radish, and turnip. Of course, the thrill of discovery, a lot of farmers are now excited about building soil health and using cover crops. I just was at our Soil and Water Conservation District, and the winner of this year's Conservationist of the Year talked about how much excitement there was now on his farm to use cover crops and to build soil health. This is an example of something I'm doing on my farm, is now seeding 100% of my cover crops as I harvest. And here I'm using a Gandy air seeder to air seed under the snoots of the corn head so that I can get that cover crop on as I harvest each field, and then put that mulch through the corn head on top of the seed before I pass over it with the combine. So this is a fun and exciting thing that I'm doing on my farm. So it's also a very efficient way to get cover crops on. So as you work with people interested in putting cover crops on, there's always how do you get them on effectively and efficiently and cost effectively. I'm using now, because I'm getting such good stands, about 10 pounds per acre of mixes. So here would be an example of annual ryegrass planted, where I'm going to go with soybeans, and oftentimes I will use annual ryegrass, crimson clover, and maybe radish or turnips or rape in with some combinations where I'm going with corn. I am putting a lot of rape in because with an air seeder you need small seed. You need to be able to cover a lot of acres per fill-up. So I'm switched now away from cereal rye and peas to all the small seeded cover crops. So I'm using a lot of the smallest seeded. And here's an example of last fall, the tremendous growth we got by getting that seed on quickly. Here we harvest, earlier than we do in a lot of parts of the Corn Belt, but a lot of these concepts could be used after wheat in the northern Corn Belt. But here again, this was air seeded in as I picked the corn. You can see the frost has killed the volunteer corn, but we've got a lot of biomass growing out there that is going to be a great tool for building the yields into the next year's crop. I also have put a Gandy air seeder onto my grain platform so that I can put a different mixture as I'm harvesting my soybeans, getting ready for the next year's corn crop. And again, this is air seeded on. This mix would be probably annual ryegrass and crimson clover mix, probably a 60-40 mix of crimson clover and annual ryegrass. And I just blow that on behind the head so that as the chopper blows out the residue behind the combine, it's mulching that cover crop, and we're done once we're through harvesting. And this would be an example of what I'd plan into. I usually let my cover crops go until I see some early blooming on the crimson clover so that I can get as much nitrogen as possible available for that year's corn crop. That nitrogen isn't necessarily available. You still need to put nitrogen beside the row, but as that melts into the ground, that biomass melts into the topsoil, as that corn crop needs that nitrogen more, at tossling or at chest high, that's when that nitrogen would be available. So we're really building in to capturing a lot of nutrients that we can use to credit and reduce the amount of nitrogen that I have to purchase to put on these fields. So it's about controlling input cost, but driving the maximum profit. I'm also able to graze my cattle out on cover crops in the springtime. And again, as you can see here, it's pretty hard to keep up with the cover crops. So I basically just utilize maybe 30 or 40 acres out of 2,000 acres of cover crops for cattle grazing because there's just so much of it. As we've talked about, as Kristine said, there's a lot of carbon going out of these power plants in my area. We have 5 coal-fired power plants surrounding my county. There's a tremendous amount of carbon out there. It's the building block of healthy soils. Not only can we utilize this carbon, but we can be a solution to these climate issues that we're facing up against and are so hard on farmers and farming. And again, cover crops give us the ability to do that, where a lot of other ways of sequestering carbon aren't nearly as cost effective and environmentally friendly. So we're looking for life on Mars. I like to think the better effort and the better money spent looking for life on Earth as we build soils under the surface of the Earth. So experiencing the richness of Earth is an investment in our soil bank, contributing to clean water, healthy ecosystems, and a healthy family. All of these can go towards a bottom line that it gives us all a better opportunity to have a future for future generations using cover crops, using cropping systems, using healthy soils. And I want to thank have the opportunity to look into the horizons of where we're going in agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. And thank you, Kristine. I think we have a little bit of time left for a few questions. And I know there's been some issues with my audio. We haven't been able to fix it, and I apologize for that. Hopefully you can hear me, but I'll limit my talking. I'll quickly read a few questions as we wrap things up today. Kristine, this one came in while you were talking. Do fungicides have any impact on mycorrhizal?
That's a good question. Fungicides do have some impact on mycorrhizae. Its impact can be fairly limited. Most of the research has shown. Again, we're continuing to learn more and more about how that impacts the system. When it comes to mycorrhizal fungi, though, a lot of times their biggest impacts come from tillage disturbing the hyphal networks and a lack of carbon food. And the impacts from fungicides can be fairly short term in most of the systems.
Thank you, Chris. This next question I'm going to open up to both of you. Do the plant mixtures make it harder to time termination before the intended crop?
This is Ray. It can be, especially if you're trying to maximize the nitrogen cycling with a legume. However, it also depends on whether you're using annual ryegrass or cereal rye as a foundation. Annual ryegrass can be difficult to kill, and so the timing on the annual ryegrass is critical versus cereal rye. So it depends a lot on what is in that mixture, but annual ryegrass usually is the one that needs the most attention and termination.
Thank you, Ray.
I'm sort of leaving most of it up to Ray to answer those questions. I guess from my perspective with things, if you can get carbon going below ground, if you can get a plant growing for about 3 weeks, you can get that happening. And so another thing to keep in mind with these cover crop systems is you're not growing them to harvest a crop. So, you know, I think there are ways to, as Ray said, you know, some ways to manage depending on what crops you're growing to manage termination.
Thank you, Kristine. We have time for maybe a couple more. With a big green cover crop, do you worry about green bridge and disease carryover to your crop you're seeding?
I guess this is Ray. Disease, I feel like, is lessened. The more health you build and translate into the growing crop, the better it is to withstand disease. So no longer do I have as much interest in using fungicides or insecticides, because of healthy plants, I feel like from a healthy soil are more resilient and be able to withstand disease pressure. So I think it is lessened versus increased.
I echo that those comments, Ray, and I guess too, when you look at it, cover crops provide a way for managing disease issues, because you can utilize them as a tool to break some of those green bridges depending on the choices that you make. So if that's part of the question you want to answer, choosing cover crops that are going to help you address those disease issues. And again, what Ray said about the health of the plant, reducing some of the impacts with disease and some of the issues with that. From a soil health standpoint, the same thing happens. As you increase the diversity of the organisms that are in the soil, you're improving predator and prey relationships so that disease organisms can't get populations growing out of control. A lot of times our diseases are not bad organisms, but they're population control issues. And cover crops can be a way to manage that, not just, you know, by providing more carbon, but also by providing different types of carbon to nitrogen ratios, which are going to stimulate different populations of organisms and help with that management.
And one thing I would add is, if you're worried about that, I would stay away from wheat. Wheat can be a bridge over to corn diseases, so if you're going to corn, I definitely want to hold away from wheat.
And we'll wrap it up with one last question, Ray. This one is directed to you. Can you talk more about the Gandy air seeder on your combine? How many acres and on late harvested acres?
All right, that's about a 10-bushel box. It's driven hydraulically, which drives the blower that, you know, distributes the seed down the air tubes. The motor on the shaft is driven electrically, so it kicks on and off if you raise and lower the head, and distributes it at about, I'm using about 10 pounds per acre, so I can get about 15 to 20 acres per fill-up. But again, when you move to real small seeded crops, you can get farther. And the big advantage of it is when you leave the field, whether it rains that night or for the next 2 weeks, using the air seeder at harvest allows you to get a lot of cover crop down very cost effectively. When we drilled cover crops, we would have a lot of damage to the tires of the tractors and the drills and that freshly cut corn and soybeans, and also it tied up a person drilling. So once you decided you're going to put a cover crop on every acre, if you've got a bulk tender and an air seeder on your head, it's one of the most time-wise, most efficient ways and cost-effective ways I think you can get a cover crop on.
Thank you, and that's about it for the time we have today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Kristine and Ray, for your presentations, and also final thank you to our sponsors. Please join us next Thursday, March 13th, as we again talk about cover crops. Thank you, everyone. That concludes today's webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.